Is grass-finished beef really better, or is it just marketing hype? Well, science has finally come through and given us an answer. For years now, individuals have argued about whether grass-finished beef is actually better than conventionally grain-finished beef. Up until recently, this was a pretty heavily opinionated conversation, and it was mostly just opinion. There wasn't a lot of scientific fact to fall back on to actually establish a position from. But new scientific research has put that debate to rest. Researchers like Dr. Stefan van Vliet and Dr. Fred Provenza, as part of a bigger team of researchers, have analyzed beef at the molecular level, and their findings, well, they're undeniable in what they found. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why grass-finished beef is superior and why it actually makes a difference for your health. The nutrient breakdown between grass-finished beef and grain-fed beef is the most logical place to start. That's generally the key factor that most of us are dialed into. And let's pick it up with the fats. One of the things that we clearly see as different about grass-finished beef is that there is a higher omega-3 concentration in grass-finished beef. And when you're talking about aspects like cardiovascular health, brain health, that difference in omega-3s makes a difference. But I also want to point out that the total amount of omega-3s that are delivered in beef is not dramatically high. It is relevant and it should be a consideration. But the point here is that it's not the only fat that you should be thinking about when it comes to grass-finished beef. We should also be looking at fats like conjugated linoleic acid, which has been linked to many different roles in the body, from things like typically most individuals will talk about aspects like its anti-inflammatory benefits and fat loss, but conjugated linoleic acid can also play roles in blood sugar regulation, in terms of neurological health, with helping to offset things like anxiety. There's many roles in the body for conjugated linoleic acid, and it is clearly found in higher levels in grass-finished beef compared to grain-fed beef. Now, there's also saturated fat composition here, and this is truly one of the attributes. We've tended to have shunned saturated fats, but saturated fats, especially good saturated fats like stearic acid, which is one we would see highly concentrated in grass-finished beef. Stearic acid is an excellent stabilizer of cell membranes and an attribute to consuming appropriately raised cattle. Again, grass-finished, if you will. But the fats are not the only difference between grass-finished and grain-fed animals. In fact, that's really just scratching the surface, and it's something that we have known about for a while. But as it relates to where we're at today, the differences are even more emphatic than what were initially perceived. And you just have a better overall fatty acid profile with grass-finished beef, and one that is less inflammatory, which also starts to beg the question of, when you look at differences or look at statements of how beef is positioned as being detrimental to long-term health or being associated with certain chronic diseases, you have to ask yourself not just what the problems with that research are, but you also have to acknowledge that a lot of that is dependent on how those animals were raised. And in general, we're not talking about grass-finished animals in these studies that are making these associations. All the problems with those study types aside. Now, when you look at some of the micronutrients that are found in grass-finished beef, one of the things that you're going to find are higher levels of the B vitamins, minerals like magnesium, potassium, zinc. These are not only going to be in higher amounts, but they're also in forms that are more easily assimilated in the body. These are often called heme forms of these nutrients, but they're more easily obtained and assimilated in the body. But what I want to show you, remember I said that science has taken us to the point now, based on what work is being done out there by researchers, that we truly have a different mindset about this conversation between grass-fed versus grain-fed. And at least as it looks in the recent with the recent studies, this debate is starting to come to an end because there really is a difference here. And I also want to point out that nothing in this conversation that I'm having with you today is meant to say anything negative about conventionally raised beef. Conventionally raised beef is still a great nutritional product. It's just that grass-finished beef is superior. And if you're an individual that cares about optimizing your health, you want every ounce of nutrition from your food possible, then you're looking for a grass-finished source of beef. You're not just looking for grain-fed beef. There is a difference. And some of that, or let me talk about what some of those differences are. To do that, I want to bring into this conversation now two researchers that I have had the fortune of being able to share the stage with in the past, and that I have both learned a lot from reading the work that they do, the research that they do. There's so much information that can be gleaned from their studies where they're both contributing to these. And for example, when you look at Dr. Stefan van Vliet, he's been able to show that there is a superior nutrient profile in grass-finished beef compared to grain-fed beef. And we'll talk about how that happened here in a moment, what techniques were actually used to do that. But also when you look at Dr. Fred Provenza's work and just his observation in nature of how animals self-select their forage, and then in turn how that creates a healthier animal, looking at some of the things that they select, like what are called tannins, to have anti-parasitic effects. The important thing to note here is that when those animals are selecting those forages in the environment, that's moving through the food chain, meaning that a lot of these secondary components that are in that forage are now being incorporated into the meat. They're being used therapeutically by the animal, but they're also incorporated into the meat, which now translates into, as we consume those meat products, that there's going to be a secondary benefit for us there as well. Now, how did these two researchers, and in addition the team of researchers that they work with here, who are also more than should be mentioned in this conversation too. Unfortunately, I just don't know their names off the top of my head, but they're equally relevant to this conversation. They have moved into a technique of what's known as metabolomics research. Now, that's a big $5 word, but just to break that word down and make sense out of it, metabolomics is really nothing more than the study of small molecules, metabolites. So if you think about the study of metabolites, and these can be in the food, they can be in the body, and keeping attention towards how these metabolites impact overall health, well, that's what metabolomics is. And so when you're looking at first identifying what the differences between these metabolites are in grain-fed animals versus grass-finished animals, it just becomes very clear that the metabolite diversity in the grass-finished animal is going to be greater than what you see in a grain-fed animal. And these metabolites in general are going to have more health-promoting effects. Those are just not found in grain-fed beef. So when that animal is only being fed grain and they're not out in the pasture or in their natural rangeland consuming that diversity of plants, those metabolites don't accumulate, and therefore you don't yield the benefit from them. And so when we now say, and when we have said in the past, that grass-finished beef is a healthier product, well, now we can actually firmly validate that it is indeed a healthier product. And if you're asking yourself at this point, well, why does that matter to me? Why is that important to my health? Well, keep in mind a couple of factors here that I've talked about. Let's translate what we've discussed at this point into application for your health. And that is that the standard American diet is vastly deficient in omega-3s. And it's also vastly deficient in antioxidants. You don't have to reach very far to draw a conclusion that chronic diseases, whether you're talking about things like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autoimmune conditions. It doesn't matter what chronic disease we're talking about. There is an inflammatory thread through all of these. And if we can take actions to mitigate that inflammation, then we can at least start to make some headway against any or multiple of these chronic diseases. And so the inclusion of higher amounts of omega-3s and antioxidants, well, they support that. Remember, grass-finished beef is also not giving you as high a concentration of the omega-6s, so you're really hitting this from both sides of the fence, if you will. Now, there is a higher nutrient density. There's just more nutrients. There's more fat-soluble nutrients, vitamin A, D, E, are going to be found, well, vitamin A and E especially, not so much D. Vitamin A and E are going to be found in higher concentrations here. Those secondary metabolites with their own therapeutic value. And this is something else I think that's probably important for you to note in regards to what was found with some of those metabolites, is that the health of the animal was better evaluated as well. And so when we see an animal, let me liken this. Let me give you an analogy to a human. We've all seen individuals where we look at that individual and we say that is not a healthy individual. That is an individual with metabolic issues, whether it's blood sugar or otherwise, blood sugar, lipids, fats, if you will, cholesterol, these kind of things, versus the individual who you look at and you can just see health radiating from that person. So the same thing, just as you would draw labs on humans to validate these things, we can see the same things in animals. And animals that are grass finished have a more healthy metabolic profile. Animals that are grain finished have an unhealthy metabolic profile. Yes, they still give you protein, they still give you meat, they still give you some nutrients there, but it's just not to the same level of what you get with a grass-finished product. And if you've got an animal that is leaning towards metabolic dysfunction, logic would suggest that you as the human seeking optimal health, that's not the desirable choice you want to make. You want to make a choice for food that exemplifies what it is you're trying to achieve. Grass-finished accomplishes that. But there's a bigger picture here overall, right? So this is why when you think about grass finished really is the future. And if you're hung up on terminology of grass-fed, if that's the term that you've been really seeking out, then I would highly recommend you look at some of my other videos where I distinguish between grass-fed and grass-finished and even differentiating pasture raised, making sense of what all these mean so you as the consumer know how to make appropriate choices. But just to give you the Cliff Notes version on this, to take you up to what the punchline is, it's grass-finished from a source that you can validate that is what you should be seeking, which means you need a local source to be purchasing from. These animals that we're talking about, keep in mind, again, I'm going back to the big picture here. Better for the environment. So we're talking regeneration, soil optimization, animals that are raised in their natural environment. And there's no confined feedlots. A lot of the problems with factory farming that we hear, higher stress animals, you're not getting any of that. You're eating animals that are lower stress, that were maintained in an environment that helped them optimize both their genetics and their physical expression, which again translates to a healthier product. And frankly, guys, it's just better for you because a higher quality meat, if someone is going, like I'll use our ranch as the example. If I'm going through all of this to raise and finish an animal on grass and make sure that that animal has nothing but grass and forage for the entirety of its life, I'm sure not going to mess all of that up by giving growth stimulants or antibiotics or exposing that animal to other chemicals that could really be a detriment to overall health of the people that I'm serving with our product as well as my family. So that's the other attribute to eating in this direction as well. So the debate's over, guys. Science confirms that grass-finished beef is nutritionally superior. And I'd really like to hear from you below. Go ahead and comment. Have you noticed a difference in how you feel when you eat grass-finished beef compared to grain-fed beef? And if you're looking for sources, if you've listened to this conversation now and you're thinking, okay, I'm on board, I want to look for some grass finished beef, where do I go look for that? Should I source it from butcher box? Should I source it from good ranchers? Well, how about if I told you that there's a third option that you may not even know about here that you need to be thinking about? Click on that video on the screen to find out more.